On to Erin and Julia.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we're really excited to talk with you about preparing for post-secondary education in terms of accommodations and support. And so post-secondary education is just a fun way of saying college or university, all of the education that happens after or post high school. So my name is Julia Gorman. I am the Assistant Director for the Educational Access Center at Boise State. And I'll let Erin introduce herself.
And I'm Erin Sutton. I'm the Assistant Director for the Center for Disability Access and Resources at the University of Idaho.
Thank you. So we're going to chat about disability services in higher education. So disability services at colleges and university, and we're going to really focus on first who we are and where we're located, as well as some of those differences between high school and college, as well as some of those shifts in accommodations that you can anticipate. So first, disability services or disability resource centers. We unfortunately all have different names, but we usually have access or disability in our name. So the Educational Access Center, that's my office. The Center for Disability Access and Resources is Erin's office. We serve the same role though. So our job is to support students in getting academic accommodations if they have a disability. And so these disabilities range so much, and we really work with all students of varying diversities in regards to disabilities. So students with learning disabilities, physical disabilities, medically based disabilities, mental health related needs, neurodivergence such as ADHD and autism. And so a lot of those high frequency disabilities as well as those low frequency. I also don't have mentioned, but of course, students who are deaf or hard of hearing or blind or have low vision are included in that as well. And so our job is to provide the academic accommodations for students to help reduce and remove barriers to their academic experience related to their disability. And so we are not special to Boise State and University of Idaho. Offices, or at least a person like ours, exists at almost all trade schools, community colleges, and four-year universities across the United States. And the golden rule is that if the school accepts federal funding, if they're FAFSA eligible, then they have to provide accommodations. And so it's our office's job to ensure that students are getting reasonable and appropriate accommodations, and to ensure that, faculty is complying with it. So the difference is there are some big jumps between what students may get in high school in regards to support related to their disability and what students get in college. And so, of course, in high school, students' rights are protected by IDEA, and teachers and administrators are case managers, our special ed teachers are our team leads for those IEPs. Maybe those 504 plans usually involve school counselors. And the purpose of these plans are really to identify the student's disability, what are some of the barriers associated with it, and how can we provide specialized instruction, accommodations, the assessments used to identify some of that to guarantee the student success. So that is the focus in high school, right? Those plans are to guarantee student success, guarantee that they graduate. And in that process, the school is responsible for identifying the needs of the students, initiating those services. And they really involve the parents a lot of the time, right? Erin and I were both special education teachers previously, and so we understand this process on the IEP team really well, and that we want parents involved, and that it really is a team decision for those IEP team meetings. And so, in high school, I always tell students we have hopefully them on the IEP team, right, for those transition plans, parent or family member, their case manager, another teacher, an admin, possibly a school psych on there. And then there's also SLPs, OTs, right? All of our other service providers. That's 6 people on their IEP team. When they get to college, it goes down to 2. It goes to the student and their access coordinator or their disability services professional like Erin or myself. And so once they get to college, their rights are protected by ADA. Now, I know sometimes there is this misconception that, oh, if a student is taken off their IEP and onto a 504 plan, oh, their 504 plan, they go transfers directly into college. IEPs and 504s are not used. Even though we are Section 504 of ADA, a 504 plan in high school is not a direct transfer into college. And so we use IEPs and 504 plans as pieces of supporting documentation, but it's not an automatic transfer in. And not everything is appropriate or reasonable for the college setting, and not everything is done exactly the same. Now, with these accommodation letters that we send out, they ensure the equitable access for the student. So it does not guarantee their success. It ensures that the student has the equitable opportunity and access to be successful just as every other student. And that is done through the reasonable and appropriate accommodations. Unlike high school, where in K-12, schools are responsible for identifying the student, in college, schools or students are responsible for identifying themselves to us. So we, unfortunately, are not notified of students with disabilities coming in, students who had IEPs or 504s, first to protect the students, right, against discrimination laws with the admittance process. But students have to self-identify and say, hey, I'm a student, I want accommodations for disability-related reasons, and come to our offices. That's part of why Erin and I love coming to these transition fairs. We do monthly workshops every month, educating students and professionals about this stuff, because that is a huge shift for students. Another big shift for our families and for our parents is that parents only have access to what the student allows. So parents are welcome to join for that initial meeting when we meet with students to establish accommodations. But if the student says they don't want their parent there, then Erin and I get to be the bad guys, and we get to politely invite the parent to wait outside as we meet with their student. And that's because the student's an adult now and it's their decision. And so they dictate what the parent has access to and what they're allowed to know. If a parent calls and asks us, is Camille using her accommodations? I will say that's a great question to ask Camille. Or, hey, is Jacob showing up to class? I don't even know that information. That's a great question to ask Jacob. And all that good stuff. And so really with this shift, again, I named off some members of the IEP team, right? That 6-person team goes down to 2, and the decisions are made by the student. So people like myself and Erin, we help the student in determining what those reasonable and appropriate accommodations for their classes are. But it's the student who decides first if they want to self-identify and even get accommodations. And then second, if they want to use their accommodations. Students choose which classes they get to use their accommodations in, and which accommodations fit in which class. And so it's customized to each class. Some students request accommodations in a science lab, but not in their English language class, because maybe their English class is accessible to them, but their science lab isn't. And so those decisions get to be made by the student with, of course, the support of us. And I'll let Erin talk more about this accommodation shift.
Yes. Okay, so accommodations overview. So just like Julia said, going off of, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but the documentation that comes through our office will often see 504s and IEPs that already have accommodations listed, and we'll use those to guide some decision making or just guide our conversations with students. But what to expect in college or higher education and with what accommodations will actually do. They're intended to reduce and remove barriers to the academic experience. And a lot of this is through our assistive technology supports and tools. Some examples could be like permission to audio record, or maybe an assistive technology piece like a smart pen, which is a recording device. maybe some extended time on tests. That's removing a barrier for a student. They are reasonable and appropriate. And like Julia said, they depend on the class and the class requirements, and also what the student is wanting and needing. So going back to that example for the English class versus the science class, like some students might feel that English and writing and reading is a strength of theirs, and they might not want an accommodation for that course. And maybe, you know, math and science is not their jam. And so they feel more barriers in those types of courses. And so that's where those accommodations might be more heavily weighted on those courses. So what accommodations don't do, they don't provide modifications to the course content or requirements. So they're still expected to meet the learning outcomes of each course. And we don't fundamentally alter the course. And Julia has a really great little blurb about her fundamental alteration. So I'm going to have you take that away, Julia. Sorry to throw that on you. I just really liked what you said last presentation.
That's okay. So fundamental alteration is really, does what the student is asking for, does it change what the other students in the class are expected to do? Does it stray from that? Does it change the learning outcome? So for example, a test, right? I know a common accommodation in high school could be, instead of a student answering a 4-answer multiple choice question, they're answering a 2-answer. In college, we consider that a fundamental alteration because it is modifying the test itself. Other students, that would create unfairness and inequity for other students. Extended time does not create inequity, because if a student has a reading barrier and they need the extended time to comprehend, well, that's, you know, that's providing equity to the student, and they're still taking the same exact test. So the product and the learning outcome is the same as their peers. They're just getting a reduction of their barrier. And so as long as it's not changing anything of the learning outcome or the product that they're creating, that has been already determined to be, you know, this shows the student meets learning outcomes of the course, then it's appropriate. If it changes it, then it fundamentally alters. Can't remember the way I phrased it last session, but I think
that was perfect. That was great. I loved that. Thank you. Accommodations are also not going to provide any specialized instruction, which, you know, is going to be could be a big difference from students who are currently in high school, you know, receiving specialized instruction in math or something like that. In a way that, you know, you can get your accommodations. So say, like, for example, if a student doesn't have higher skills in math and they really struggle in that area, accommodations paired with going to tutoring or going to academic coaching or other resources on campus can almost provide a similar service that they had received before, but it just is going to be taken from different areas of campus and not always through our office. So those additional resources that I'm talking about, like the writing center or, you know, additional math tutors, or we have something at U of I that's called SI Pass, which is peer-led tutoring for students who have like previously been very successful in the course, and it's like a weekly established study group. Those are not through the disability services offices, but they are just resources that are offered to all students on campus. But paired with accommodations, may see some success there. The other thing that we do not do with accommodations is we don't apply them to all classes. Some classes, like we said, may not require specific accommodations. So the one example I used last presentation was a testing accommodation for a yoga class would not be necessary because they're likely not having tests in a yoga class. Thank you. Shift in accommodation expectations. So these are some examples that we've come up with. So what a student may currently receive. So Kelsey has a designated peer. She sits next to in math class. That peer takes notes for Kelsey and helps her with classwork when needed. So something that you would see in post-secondary education would be a note-taking tool or technology. Both our university and Boise State, we use something called Note Taking Express, which is an app that the students are responsible for recording their lectures, and then they send it off for notes. So that is an accommodation that can be provided to students. Our next example would be Troy gets up to 1 week extension on all assignments. So that is too broad, and we would not approve an accommodation or offer an accommodation like that. Something that you're going to likely see at a college or university is going to be probably to 48 hours or 1 to 2 days is how it's worded at our university. I know Boise State uses 48 hours. And it really it gives basically another deadline for them to be responsible for, but giving them that extended time if they need it. Our next example would be Maria gets extra time on quizzes and exams, time unspecified. Also will not see that in college or universities. We are going to put a certain amount of time that will be extended on those quizzes and exams. The most common is the time and a half, but dependent on the interactive process and what the student is saying and what their their documents are reporting. There might be some adjustments with that, but yeah, pretty standard is time and a half for extended time. And then just our little blurb at the bottom, thanks. Accommodations reduce and remove barriers. They do not guarantee success. Okay, the interactive process and documentation practices. So like Julia said, the student is responsible for self-reporting to our offices, and they are going to tell us about their disability or their diagnoses, the barriers, and things that impact them in their education. And through the interactive process, we'll have a meeting with them that will be about an hour, where we go over, their history in education, what they feel their strengths are, what they feel their weaknesses are, their barriers, subjects they struggle with, how they do with testing, how they take their notes, what they're comfortable with when they present in class, just all of the things that they've probably experienced in their educational journey so far and what they'll likely continue to do in college. We talk to them about, or they'll bring it up to us. And so that's also great if you guys have students now that you're preparing for these conversations, is like getting them comfortable with talking about their disability, getting them comfortable about talking about what they feel like their strengths and weaknesses are. I know that's like a pretty common practice in high schools for transition services and transition goals and things like that. So yeah, just getting those students comfortable with those conversations, I think, is super important. And then the documentation piece, generally we all stick to the same guidelines, I would say. But we're looking for something that has a diagnosis or has a qualifying eligibility. It could be an educational record, which would be a 3-year evaluation, an IEP with an eligibility, any healthcare provider that writes, if it's a medical related disability, school psychologist report, like I said, the 3-year. So we take, depending on the disability, it depends on what documentation we're looking for. I know something we've not spoke about, but like if we're looking outside of academic accommodations and a student might need some type of housing accommodations, we look for pretty specific documentation about why they would need certain housing accommodations. And so those are usually written by their healthcare providers, or if it's mental health related, a psychiatrist or something like that. So clinical psychologists. Anything you want to add there, Julia?
No, that was perfect. I'm glad you mentioned the housing, because housing is probably one of the only, not one of the only accommodations, but for sure one of the accommodations where like an IEP or 3-year eligibility would not be appropriate documentation for a housing accommodation. Documentation for housing accommodations specifically have to name and say what the accommodations are. Whereas when it comes to IEPs and eligibilities and the student self-report, we can do more of those professional inferences of, oh, it looked like this in high school, it could look like this in college. Whereas that's just not the case for housing accommodations.
Perfect. Considerations and next steps. So how to prepare now, we kind of talked about this. So just talking with your students about being a self-advocate, being able to talk about their disability or their diagnoses, how they feel impacted in the classroom, how they feel impacted by certain things in their academic journey, their strengths, where they want to grow, and really, I know, like, so I know Julie and I really help them kind of find their words sometimes, because especially incoming freshmen can be pretty nervous about these meetings. And so I know I do some leading and some suggestions that I'll throw out, or leading questions to get them to talk to me. But I think these are great things to practice with high school students now, so that they aren't so nervous when they're meeting with us. But that's also good to see too, because I didn't talk about that in the interactive process. We are like looking at how they're like visually affected by, and how they're physically affected by, like, the conversations that we're having. You know, someone's saying they're really anxious, and I can see a student like picking at their fingers and getting really fidgety. You know, that's something that we're able to use our judgment and say, yeah, they're probably struggle with some anxiety or nervousness in certain situations. So and then being proactive. So just knowing the difference between high school and college, attending things like this. Again, my shameless plug for Julia and I is we have monthly transition presentations that we do that are various topics, that are really geared towards high school students, teachers, parents, families. And then just getting to learn about their accommodations, why they have their accommodations, how it benefits them. And then making sure that they're asking for help. So I know, especially, and Julie, I think mentioned this, I came from a high school setting before, and I was a resource teacher. And you know, the students who get to the point where they're like, I just don't want to be in study skills. So just still encouraging them. I mean, if they're ready to not be in study skills, then great, but like encouraging them to find different ways to utilize their time, and like finding their areas of growth that you can then focus on with them to be able to make their time meaningful and things like that. So I think that's all I got.
And then I like to throw this out here too. So like I said previously, and what Erin and I have been sharing, our offices are not special to Boise State and U of I. We love all of our future Broncos and Vandals, but understand that not everyone's going to be a Bronco or Vandal. Maybe they want to be a Yote over at College of Idaho. Or maybe they want to go to CSI. And so, as you can see, like we said earlier, our offices, unfortunately, we don't all have the same name at colleges and universities, but typically you'll see the word accessibility, disability, or accommodations in our names. And so these are the direct links to all of the disability resource centers for Idaho post-secondary schools. And so if your student is interested in a school outside of Idaho, beautiful. Typically you can find their disability services office by saying like Arizona State University student accommodations or Arizona State University disability support. And you'll be able to find their office. And to get started with that interactive process that Erin had talked about, most of our processes of how to get started are the same, which is going to our website, completing the form on the website, talking about just some introductory information about your disability or disabilities, how it impacts your learning and other accommodations you want to discuss. Once that form's filled out, our office will get in contact with you to set up that a meeting to go through that interactive process that Erin went more in depth about. So most of our offices operate in that same flow. But if you have questions, or you want to chat with us more, we have our emails and our websites, and then we both have advocacy tools and transition resources on our websites as well. And there's a really cool activity that we both have called Preparing for the Shift, where students talk about why they have an IEP or 504, 3 ways their learning's impacted by their disability, and then list their accommodations, how helpful they are, how often they use them, and why they use them. And so I always tell our high school students and high school teachers that that's a great activity for students to use in preparation for their IEP meeting, and a really good place for them to start talking about accommodations in a comfortable, safe manner. So, Erin, would you add anything else?
No, I think that was it.
Beautiful. All right. Does anyone have any questions?